Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest teaching session in the course on technology and the future of medicine. Today we're very honored to have Jonathan White speaking. Dr. White has recently won the 3M Award. It seems like every powerful person around us, the dean and the president, has been writing about this fact, so he's very much in the news. We're very proud to have him as a part of this course. Today he's talking about technology and the future of education. John, take it away.
Thank you very much, Kim. So thank you for coming. This is nice for me because normally I'm sitting in a lecture with maybe, 165 medical students and maybe 40 dental students, so it's nice to be in a room with a smaller number of students. Kim told you my title already, which really I only decided on over the last couple of days, because I've talked on a number of different things. I think this is actually the 6th time I've talked in this course. So the other titles that I had, that was the first one I did, and we did it in the pathology department, actually over at the University Hospital. I talked about embodiment and the age of spiritual machines. Then I did another talk where I talked about kind of technology and the body, kind of from a surgeon's perspective, about where technology is taking us and what it might mean. Then I talked, I kind of did that talk again, but I added a bit of extra material and I called it Welcome to the Singularity. And then I became a bit more skeptical as time went on. I give this talk where I sort of enumerated 9 or 10 myths of the singularity, myths of the near future. And then the last one I gave was probably in the fall, was the future so bright you got to wear shades, where I really get quite skeptical about the singularity. So I kind of wonder why do I keep saying yes to Kim? Why do I keep coming back to give this talk? Because I know other people kind of give the same talk again, right? Like they give the same set of slides, maybe with a different emphasis or different twist or some different questions. Why do I kind of keep coming back? Because I'm a surgeon. This isn't my field, technology and futurism and that sort of thing, singularitarianism. I spend 50 or 60% of my time at the Royal Alexandra Hospital, like operating on people. Like I spent all day yesterday in the operating room, and in the rest of my time, I'm an academic over here at the university, largely focused on teaching. I guess if I can explain my interest, it starts off by reading the work, right? By reading Kurzweil's 2 books about the age of spiritual machines. And actually, I read this one first, The Singularity is Near. I read that one first, and it kind of blew me away. I do have a background interest. If you've watched any of the other talks on YouTube, I've got a background interest in science fiction. So I can talk forever about Ian Banks and Greg Bear and Philip K. Dick. As I say, I have become more of a skeptic over the years. I think this is a nice slide on skepticism. It says, making you the sole survivor of every Kool-Aid cult. Like I'm probably the last guy in the room who wants to drink the Singularity Kool-Aid. And I've been to Singularity University, I've been to Future Med as well. I've seen some of the people we're talking about kind of up front. I don't think, as I've said before in previous talks, I don't think technology is the solution to everything. I think if technology is going to do anything, it's going to lead us into more interesting areas where we develop more interesting problems and we make more interesting mistakes in the future. I don't think it's going to be a long-term fix. Equally, I kind of criticize this slightly lazy thinking about exponentials. That, oh, don't worry, exponential technology advancement will just fix everything. Next year it'll be 2 times faster, and the year after it'll be 4 times faster. I don't really buy that either. And I would like us to see us harnessing new technology to do amazing new things, but I think ultimately we're not actually getting exponentially wiser or kinder. So we'll probably end up doing many of the same things we do currently with our new technology. I read a statement, or maybe an interview by Peter Diamandis, who's one of the kind of spokesmen of the Singularity movement recently. And he talked about, you see down there in the bottom left of the slide, quite small, he talked about the way the singularity was changing, or the way the people involved with the singularity were changing. And he came right out and said it. He said, for the last few years, the singularity has been a deception. He said, we have deceived people about what this might be and where it might be going. And he said he hoped that it was moving from deception into delivery, where things would actually be moving forwards and we'd see some development, like actual practical stuff in in the real world. I thought that was very, very honest of him to say that to some degree the singularity has been overhyped and overblown, and the future isn't coming just yet, perhaps. So, I mean, I think when I talk about the singularity, I still have more questions than answers. I still wonder why we're so focused on the future when there's so much to fix here in the present. Like, forget about the future and work with me today on some stuff that we're doing. I'm quite sort of critical about the singularity. But I don't really want to talk a lot about the singularity today, because that's not my topic. My topic is this: the future of education. The course is called Technology and the Future of Medicine. So I thought I'd talk a bit about education. I don't think any of our other speakers are talking about education specifically. And I'm not specifically talking about medical education. I'm talking about education in general, largely kind of higher level university education, kind of advanced education. And as Kim says, I was very pleased this year to be named as the recipient of the 3M National Teaching Fellowship. So there's about 40 teachers nominated across the country, and they give out 10 awards every year. I'm the only person who won it at the U of A this year. And I'm the first surgeon ever to win it, actually. There have been physicians who have won it from other disciplines, but I'm the first one who's a surgeon. And it's a mistake to say that the 3M award is a teaching award. Though Dr. White must be the best teacher in the university, that's actually not true. There are many people who are much better teachers than I am. Whenever they're deciding about the award, 50% of the award is decided on teaching scores and innovation and kind of how good a teacher you are. And I think I have to put my hands up and say, okay, someone must think I'm at least an average teacher, or maybe slightly better than average. But the other 50% is given for education leadership, for developing new courses, for looking down the road to see where we're going, for actually helping other people teach better. So, and I think I probably scored quite highly on that side, because I'm interested in programs of education, I'm interested in curriculum, I'm interested in seeing where things are going. So in fact, talking about the future of education is kind of right up my street, which is why I picked the topic for today. And this is me in the operating room number 2 in the Royal Alexandra, which is exactly where I was yesterday, operating all day. So my main interest is surgery. I'm a surgeon, I'm going to do that until I retire. But I'm also interested in education. Obviously, I'm interested, I guess all of our interests start at home, so I'm interested in how I became a surgeon, because I didn't used to be. I used to be a complete novice. I knew nothing about medicine and nothing about surgery. And something happened to me between then and now apparently in some things I'm an expert in the field, I suppose. So I'm interested in how that happened to me, and I'm interested in how that keeps on happening today to other people. I'm interested in what's happening under the hood of medical school. I'm interested in what happens when I'm training surgeons to take on the role after I finish with it. So I'm interested in education. The second thing I'm interested in is actually technology, and I was talking to the University Senate last week, and I mentioned my father, who's now retired but was an electrical engineer, and I think he would quite like me to be interested in wires and resistors and volts and amps and that sort of thing, and I'm just not. I'm not interested in that side of technology, the hardware piece. I'd love to get into 3D printing, I'd love to get into Arduino, and I just can't find a good reason for it. My heart doesn't lie to it, as they say in Northern Ireland. I'm much more interested in the technologies of communication. Like, I'm the first guy that I know who had an email address, and the first guy I know who had a website or a blog or a wiki. So that's kind of where I'm coming from: surgery plus education plus technology. And if you look at the work that I've done and things I've published on wikis and podcasts. I developed an app for the iPhone called Surgery 101. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. I've actually looked at how students use the iPhone in medical education and in clinical environments in the hospitals. And I'm also pretty active on Twitter and pretty active on Facebook as well. So I thought I'd talk about 3 main things. And I want to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, because I actually want to hear from some of you guys about what your education has been like here in 2014. I want to talk about some of the changes that I've seen associated with technology over the course of my career, kind of comparing what I did with what you guys are doing, or at least what I think you guys are doing, what I think my students are doing. As I said, I think technology leads us in a new direction, which gets us to new and more interesting problems. And I want to talk about some of the current problems in the field and how they might be solved, or how we might not want to solve them in some cases. And then I want to talk about some new stuff and kind of next directions, where education is going. And Like much of the talk about the singularity, a lot of this stuff you'll have heard a little bit about, but the question is where's the next step and what's going to happen next? And I don't think the next step is downloading ourselves onto an artificial substrate somewhere and sucking all the information in the world into our head. I think that's not going to be happening anytime soon, if at all. So let's start off with comparing and contrast. Probably what I went through as a student with what I think you might be going through as a student. And I'll focus on a particular thing, which is studying. So you see at the bottom, notice how they conveniently put dying at the end of this word. It's dying. And here's our student. It must be a modern student. It's night because it's dark and the light is on. There's a pile of textbooks which are unopened on the student's right with some kind of file folder there. The student's fallen asleep while making notes or a diagram of some sort. It looks like they've got, I don't know if that's an iPod or a phone in the bottom right. And then there's a can of Red Bull, which obviously they were trying to use to stay awake in the middle of the night while they were studying. So on the left of this picture is me in 1987. I came across this picture recently, actually. And if you look carefully at this guy, this is actually my parents' dining room. And I don't know when this was taken. I cannot tell you, because it was taken on something called a film camera. Like it was before not just before the iPhone, but before digital camera technology in general. So there's no date on this, there's no time on this, there's no geolocator. I happen to know where it is because it's in my parents' house. But it's an old-fashioned photograph. I must have been terribly formal those days. I'm studying and I'm wearing a tie. I'm wearing a tie to study. I've got some kind of file folder over here, which I'm writing notes in, I think. There's a bunch of other notes here and some screwed up paper. I've got some textbooks here, and this is an actual human skull. Like whenever I started medical school, we were advised to get hold of a skeleton, and we couldn't afford a skeleton, so we actually borrowed a skeleton from someone, and this is the skull. And it's not a plastic one like you see now, it's an actual skull. I remember when I got accepted, my father and I went to the second-hand bookstore, Queen's University Belfast, to buy some second-hand books because we actually couldn't afford the textbooks. Here's a student from today. So she's sitting in a nice bright library. She's got, looks like an Apple, probably maybe not a MacBook Air, probably just a MacBook. It's not slim enough to be a MacBook Air. She has got some paper here, but not a bunch of paper. I don't see any textbooks. She's looking at the screen, and she's writing something here. She's got earbuds in there, and she's listening on some device there. If you look closely, the guy behind her is out of focus. He's got earbuds in as well, and he's listening to something else. So 2014 compared to 1987. So what else was this guy doing in 87? Like, how did he get to be studying like this, and what were the other components? So, as I say, when you started, they gave you a massive list of textbooks you had to buy or get a hold of somehow or other. So literally that was like the stack of textbooks I started with in first year medical school, and you'll still be familiar with this today. The idea being that essentially learning is about gathering as much information as you can and cramming it into your head somehow or other. So, and it's that dreadful moment when you kind of look, like your teacher says, this is what the textbook is, and you go to the bookstore and you can't believe how big it is. Like it's giant, and you think, how am I ever going to get through something like that? And certainly if I look at my medical education, or if I look at the education of our students today, it's an enormous amount of material. I mean, I would say probably most of the material I covered in medical school was of no use to me as a doctor in practice. Really. I mean, maybe at some point I accessed one or two pieces of it, but a lot of it was just about rote learning and getting the information to go in and stay in. This was our lecture theatre, or actually very similar to our lecture theatre. Our lecture theatre was at the Institute of Clinical Science at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, and it was quite similar to this. You had rows and rows of seats, as you can see. I think there were 150 people in our medical school. And then down the front, there was an area for the lecturer to kind of prowl about the way that I'm kind of prowling here. And then there were blackboards where you could draw diagrams. And it was like a stage actually, there were little doors at the side where they actually brought patients out and brought them through and kind of paraded them here, and you could come down and examine them if you wanted. That was the lecture hall that I had in our medical school. And I think you can see actually there was like on the upper left there's some kind of a projector screen that was clearly an afterthought. They kind of added that on as new technology came along. And you'd see lecture halls like this going back. I was in Amsterdam recently and saw one that was based on this similar principle going back to the 1600s. So this is a fairly old-fashioned design for a lecture hall. You would go and the lecturer would show up, usually a kind of middle-aged man in a white coat, and he would speak. It was usually a he. And your job would be to take the notes down as quickly as possible. Actually, the girl who sat beside me in medical school managed to perfect the art of putting 3 lines of notes in each line of the lined paper. So she could take an entire lecture on just the one side of one page. And if your handwriting was bigger than that, you had to take more notes. And we actually had kind of a note-sharing club. If somebody was sick, we would bring our notes in for them. So notes were kind of the currency of medical school. The knowledge was kind of falling from the expert's lips, and we would try and pick it up and record it in our notes. Then perhaps there would be a paper or a book we'd have to go to the library for, and here's our kind of old-fashioned library. And it doesn't project very well here, but you look closely, it almost looks like some of the seating there is kind of like a church. Kind of like libraries are old places, and you see these reference numbers on each book here along the side of the shelf. It was kind of a special thing to go to the library. In fact, just towards the end of my medical school career, they discovered something called compact discs. So they started putting some indexes on compact discs. Before that, you had to look up papers in a big book called Index Medicus, which were these giant books that came out every single month. And eventually they had CDs and then a silver platter. This is before the internet. Of course, once you've been to the library, you've got to pull out a bunch of textbooks, and then you've got to read the appropriate section or all of the textbook, and then try and organize the information in your head somehow, and then kind of get it ready for retrieval. So we went through forests and forests of trees. And looking back at it now, I kind of look at it from the point of view of somebody who knows a little bit about constructivist theory, or in fact cognitivist and constructivist theory. Essentially, I was doing what's called chunking, which is you break the information up into chunks, and then you store each chunk in a certain place, and then each chunk is remembered or recalled by a certain trigger. So I used to make notes from the textbook, and then I would make notes of those notes, and then I would make notes of those notes. And finally I got down to a very small set of notes, but everything inside that set triggered everything else in the structure. So I was building up quite a detailed kind of tree of knowledge in my head based on the stuff that was in the textbook. And that's a fairly classical way of learning. So let's fast forward a bit. I guess it would be, 27 years to 2014, to our students sitting in the library today. Libraries have changed a bit since I was in them as a medical student. This is now more what your library looks like. In fact, our medical library over at the University Hospital looks a bit like this. Open spaces and light, and a lot more kind of public space and a lot more study space. They're not dark anymore. Plus, this doesn't show it very much, but a lot more computers. Like I think probably, I remember the day our medical library got its first computer. That shows you how old I am. I'm kind of showing my age now. This is actually a library in Germany, in Dresden, I think. Lecture halls have changed a bit as well. The kind of basic design is the same. I mean, we're sitting in one right now, right? But the lighting is better. You can see at the back of this one, there's lots of projectors. You're actually hearing my voice projected through a speaker system. I have this clicker thing, right? So I could actually, it would probably be slightly disturbing. I could walk behind you at this point and be speaking over the back of your head. In fact, there's no reason why I've got to be sitting near my laptop at all. I could go anywhere I want. Something our lecturers never had. In fact, I remember when we started off, Kim would remember this, we had carousels of glass slides. So the idea that I could be changing the slides that I'm using in a talk at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday, and the idea that I could change those at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning would be foreign to people who taught me. You had to have your slides ready in advance. Often people would get their assistants to use PowerPoint for them because they didn't know how to use PowerPoint. And those slides would be put on acetate film and then put behind glass slides. And then you would see speakers going to conferences with a big box under their arm, which is a circuit or carousel full of glass slides. And I realize I'm talking about essentially I'm talking about things that are as close to you as Waterloo, you know, the Napoleonic Wars. Seems like a long time ago, but it shows you how much things have changed between then and now. And we had certain problems with the technology we were using. We've got other problems with the technology that you've got as well. The big change, of course, is that information is now ubiquitous. You've got your laptops open in front of you right now. You could be tweeting about something else. You could be wondering what you're having for supper tonight. You could be texting somebody to say, buy some milk on the way home. You could be looking this up on Wikipedia. You could actually be plugged in to YouTube and listening to one of the other talks if you want, or flicking through the slides on the other talks. You could be doing anything you want at the moment. In fact, I could say something that's completely rubbish up here. It's completely false. And you could look it up on the internet right now and prove me wrong. Something that I would never have been able to do. I would never have thought of doing it, but if I had, I wouldn't have been able to do it. I'd actually challenge what the lecturer was saying live during the lecture and say, Dr. White, that thing you said about Peter Diamandis, I can't find that quote. Where did you find that? So information is now pretty much ubiquitous, and that's good in some ways, and it's bad in other ways. There's no such thing really in terms of simple fact retrieval as not knowing anymore. Like, I can be sitting watching the television with my wife, watching True Detective last night, and an actor can pop up and she'll say, who is that? Where have I seen them before? You know that bit where you see an actor and they've been in a movie and you're not quite sure? So we stopped True Detective, we looked it up on the internet, we found the cast list for True Detective, looked them up on the Internet Movie Database or Wikipedia and found out where they'd been. And that's just a casual question. Where did the actor come from that we were able to answer in real time? So information is pretty much ubiquitous. Students now have this thing you may have heard of called Google, where you can basically type in whatever you want, and it's terribly useful for finding information, as you know, just right away. You've got a question, you just Google it instantaneously. Google's now a verb, obviously. Wikipedia as well. I know I had one of our medical students ask me recently, how much of your education came from Wikipedia? And I said, none, because it wasn't around when I was being educated. And I said, how much of your education comes from Wikipedia currently? And he said, about 75%. About 75% of what I know about medicine comes from Wikipedia. Because in fact, Wikipedia is, and I know there's some people in our faculty who are quite upset about Wikipedia and say we shouldn't use it. It's very good for giving you the first sentence about something you know nothing about. If you want to know about, what was it I was looking up recently? I was visiting New Zealand, and we were traveling through a city that had had a big earthquake in the 1930s, and it occurred to us, what was New Zealand like in the 1930s? Was New Zealand affected by the Great Depression the way other places were affected, like the US and Canada and Europe? And we didn't know. And it's quite an abstract historical question, right? You'd need to speak to a historian, perhaps. We looked it up on Wikipedia, and we were able to get a pretty good summary of what happened in New Zealand in the 1930s just right away. So Wikipedia is good for that. I don't think I'd ever prescribe a drug based on Wikipedia. I don't think I'd ever do an operation based on Wikipedia. But if I come across some medical condition I've never heard of before, I can look it up on Wikipedia and at least get a basic understanding. Then my understanding will be the same as your understanding if you can use Wikipedia as well. Of course, there's the iPhone and Siri as well. And I haven't quite got used to this with the iPhone, the fact that I can use my voice to ask questions now. And when I do it with Siri, I'm quite astonished at just how good it is. How good it is at listening to my funny accent, but also how good it is at finding information. As well as that, you now have a choice about textbooks, right? You can actually buy a textbook if you want, or you can get an electronic version. You can put it on your Kindle, or you can put it on your Amazon app, on your Android tablet, or your iPad, or whatever. And again, I kind of struggle with that. I thought when this technology came out, and this is the kind of paper-like screen on the Kindle. I thought when this technology came out, I wouldn't need to buy books anymore. But I actually miss holding the book in my hand. And I still buy hardback books. It's almost like a treat or a pleasure holding a physical object in your hand to read it. And I've got myself in a position now where for books that are long, I end up buying both versions. I end up buying like the hardback version, plus I buy the Kindle version as well, so I can read it when I'm away somewhere or when I'm on the go. I'm currently reading the one about Roosevelt and Taft, Bully Pulpit, which is by one of the American historians who did the team of rivals thing about Abraham Lincoln. So I'm not quite sure. I know you can annotate on these devices, the Kindle, and you can annotate PDFs as well. I'm not quite sure how you would tackle the task that I had, which was highlighting a textbook and underlining a textbook and breaking it up and making notes. I'm not sure how that task happens with things that are on e-paper. I'd like to hear about that. I don't know if anybody in the room is using this, Evernote, which is actually a very good system for keeping notes and organizing PDFs and documents and things. And their tagline is very kind of modest. Remember everything. Not we will help you to remember, not this is a memory aid. Remember everything. You will lose nothing. You will not forget anything. So you've got tools like this to help you with your learning. Having said that, I mean, I've talked a lot about how the landscape has changed and how the technology has changed. It's still the same basic task. You've still got somebody coming into a program of education. There's still a curriculum and a syllabus and material that has to be covered and tests that have to be passed. It's still the same basic task. It's different technology now, and you've got different ways of accessing information than I had. But in some ways, these two have more in common than you think. And interestingly, the two things that are in common, I suppose, in the photograph is both of them have pens in their hands, and both of them are writing on paper. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. I mean, it's interesting when I've worked with students and done a lot of work in online education, and I would say probably about maybe 10-20% of students think online education is fantastic. They want to get rid of textbooks. They actually want to get rid of lectures as well. They don't want to come to lectures anymore. They just want to do it all online. There's maybe sort of, I guess, 60-70% in the middle of the class who use online education but want the other stuff as well. And there's maybe 10% of the class left that actually says, no, I don't want anything to do with online education. I'm happy with textbooks. I'm happy with paper. I want to be in the same room as the lecturer. We've actually had a system now in the medical school the last few years where a lecturer can turn up and give the talk, and the students are not required to attend. It's a video recorded the same way this is being recorded, and you can watch it later on. And it's broadcast, I think, an hour after the actual live lecture. And we're finding that maybe of 200 students, maybe on a good day, maybe 80 or 100 will turn up. And it's nice. I mean, for me, it's nice teaching only 80 people instead of 200 people. It's like a large, small group, essentially. And when you ask the students who don't show up how they're looking at lectures, typically they are fast forwarding. They're running the lecture at maybe speed and a half, or maybe twice speed. They can pause the lecture when they want. They can rewind and get them to say the same thing again if they didn't catch it. They can pause them and actually look things up on Wikipedia, or stop them and make a note. And if they decide they want to take a break, they can pause and go and answer the door to let the mailman in, or they can go to the bathroom or have a cup of coffee or whatever. So the student's actually in control of this. And I'll talk a little bit about Sebastian Thrun and Udacity towards the end, but Sebastian Thrun is an artificial intelligence professor who was at Stanford, and he found the same thing when he put an online version of his course on the internet, and he found that his own students stopped showing up to class. And when he asked them why, they said, we prefer the online version of you. You're easier to handle when you're online. We don't actually like, and he's a nice guy, but we prefer not to be in the same physical space as you because we don't see the benefits of that, whereas we can see the benefits of interacting with you online. And these are students who were paying tuition, students who had the right to be in the same room as this eminent professor and chose not to be. So that's just an example of how lectures are changing, but also how students have different tastes and attitudes to education, and you've got to come up with an education model that's going to fit everyone, not just the technology zealots or the technology Luddites. So let's talk a bit about current problems in the field of technology and in education. One of the big issues that students bring up is this problem, which is there's too much stuff. Like, I'm going to look up a particular topic, and where am I supposed to find the good stuff? I can find, you type something into Google, you get 1.8 million hits in the first second. Which one of those is any good? Do I have to sift through them all myself? Do I just pick the stuff that's on the first page, or do I modify my search terms? And in fact, I think it's It's a crucially important thing which isn't taught at all, like proper search strategies. I mean, occasionally I'll ask someone to look something up on Google in front of me, and I'm appalled at what they type into the search engine. I go, that's not very specific. How can you expect to get where you want to get with a search term like that? Given how much time and effort we spend going to Google and getting the answers out, really we need to learn to search things a bit better. So students, I think, can be totally overwhelmed with how much material is out there. They don't know what's good and what's bad and what's recommended and what's not. The other thing is, if you can find good stuff, how do you actually cope with the information? This is a Far Side cartoon by Gary Larson, where the student says basically, my cognitive capacity is overloaded, my brain is full, I have to leave the class now, I've had enough. And at least when you had a textbook, you could manage that. But now that you have the internet and there's so much information out there, how do you cope with that degree of information all the time? Also, how do you manage to focus? And I won't talk a lot about multitasking, but I'll maybe talk a little bit about that at the end. How do you manage your time when there's so many competing things happening at the same time? Like, they just put out season 2 of House of Cards on Netflix. And it's not like a weekly thing. It's like all 13 episodes at once. So you're able to sit for 13 hours and watch the whole thing. And there's so much other material on Netflix now. We've got kind of a waiting list now for stuff we'd like to watch on Netflix, but we just don't have enough time. Plus you've got fantastic PlayStation 3 games, PlayStation 4 games, plus you've got lots of books coming out. How do you actually manage to live in this society and this culture and keep up with the time, as well as study and as well as kind of work if you have to as well? I was talking to one of our nurses yesterday about the flight that has gone missing in Malaysia. And I think it went missing Saturday sometime, right? And she hadn't heard about it. I thought, how is that possible? Like, the whole world is wondering, where the hell is this plane? How can you not have heard about that? So some people are kind of information junkies like me, and other people maybe not so much. But how do you cope with all this information? And if you can get good information, and if you can cope with it and sift it out and manage it, once you've got it, how do you make connections to make sure that it stays in your brain so that it's there when you need it, when you can use it later on? Because knowledge is one thing, getting the building blocks is one thing, but putting it together in a way that triggers and is useful to you in practice is a totally different thing. And it's kind of experience and practice that makes those links form together in your brain. How do you make sense of the information? There's a couple of books that are relevant if you want to do a bit of reading afterwards. This one called Distracted by Maggie Jackson, talking about how the constant stream of information distracts us from our primary focus, from our primary task. It was a nice study a few years ago. They were talking about how medical students and doctors use mobile devices on hospital wards. And the devices made them more efficient, and they got better access to information more quickly. They could look up questions and get the answers in real time. But the people they work with complained, and they said, you're more globally present, but you're less locally present. Like, in this study, they said if a doctor got a text in the middle of a conversation with the nurse, they would break off the conversation and answer the text. They wouldn't have finished speaking, and the nurses felt that the technology was actually getting in the way a bit and interfering with their relationships. This is a book called The Information Diet: A Case for Conscious Consumption, which is an author called Clay Johnson, basically saying it's not enough to just be swamped with information and say that's okay. We've got to actually manage our own information so that we're not overwhelmed, so that we can actually cope with this. And he talks about how you might do that in your life. And a bit like that story with the doctor and the nurse, there's a book by Sherry Turkle called Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. She talks, in the first bit of the book, she talks about human relationships with robots. And she talks a little bit about kind of compassionate relationships and some sexual relationships with robots, like theoretical sexual relationships with robots. And then in the second bit, she talks about how our primary relationship is starting to become kind of with ourselves and our devices. And you see this sometimes in the operating room. There used to be what you would call kind of a teachable moment. So the patient is being anesthetized, the team is getting ready for the surgery, and the surgeon and the assistants are scrubbing their hands and getting ready. And usually while that would be happening, or in the 5 or 10 minutes before that, we would talk about some topic or talk about the case. And often what happens is we're standing all outside the room and we're each looking at our own iPhone. We're texting somebody, or we're obsessively checking our email, or we're looking at Facebook or something. We've actually lost the connection we have with each other because we're so connected to our devices. And I'm not saying that's a terrible thing, but I'm saying at some point you have to kind of put your device down and relate to the people around you. The other question that comes up with new technology is, what does it actually mean when you know something? And if you recognize this photograph, it's a picture of a London cab. And there's quite a history actually of London cab drivers. And you don't just buy a taxi and start driving around London. You have to be accredited. You have to pass a test to be a London taxi driver. And the test is called, this is the term for it, the test is called the knowledge. They expect their taxi drivers to be able to find any address in London without the use of maps or GPS. So they'll actually say, right, tell me how you would get to, I don't know, 25 Mornington Crescent. And the taxi driver has to have that information in their head, ready for recall at any moment, without the assistance of GPS. Because it's very easy. I know certainly when I get in a taxi at the airport here and tell them where I want to go, they just say, hang on a minute, they type it into the GPS. They don't have any native knowledge in their head of where they're going. The GPS just tells them where to go. And that's fine, except when GPS is wrong. We were just home from a vacation in New Zealand, as I said, and we used the GPS to drive around. And on a couple of occasions, it took us to totally the wrong place, or tried to get us to drive the wrong way up a one-way street. So what does it mean to know something? Certainly the taxi drivers who are driving around London who have the knowledge know what's happening. But if you're dependent upon GPS, or you're dependent upon Siri or your iPhone, do you actually know it or not? There's another book by a guy called Nicholas Carr, who talks about, the title of the book is The Shallows, and he actually talks about kind of neuroanatomy and how his hypothesis is that the brain itself is changing as our relationship with technology changes. He says, sitting down to read a book made of paper is a different activity, it's a different neurological activity than reading something on the internet. Like we scan things differently on the internet, we read in a different way, we don't retain in the same way. In fact, he talks about the difference between a scuba diver and a jet ski. And he says that the scuba diver is someone who descends into the knowledge and sits in the middle of the knowledge and kind of, gets used to it and gets familiar with it and is comfortable sitting at depth in complicated topics. Whereas he says the majority of our information, majority of the way that we know things now is like the jet ski. It kind of bumps along the surface. We know just enough to get along every day, but we don't know anything below that. So we know just as much as Google gives us on the first page of search results. We know just as much as Wikipedia gives us in that first paragraph of text, but we don't know much beyond that. He suggests. So back when I was a medical student, back in 1987, it was clear what knowing was. It was clear that, the examiners would ask you a question, and you either knew the answer or you didn't. In fact, we had an exam at the end of medical school called Final MB, the Final Bachelor of Medicine exam, where you went on to a real ward with real patients in real time and were asked what you would do with a particular patient. And if you knew, you passed, and if you didn't know, you failed. And I think 10% of our class failed that exam. So medical school in those days was largely about getting all information into your head in an organized fashion so you could recall it. Largely a cognitive structure, I have to say. Like there was some skills involved, like how you would examine someone. But largely it was about talking about things and about thinking about things and about making a diagnosis. And if you passed that, then an expert said that you knew medicine. Clearly that was something that you knew. And if you listen to Nicholas Carr, it looks like the location of knowing is going. Like the location of knowing is going away from your head and into the devices that surround us. To the point where I was talking to somebody recently in the medical school who was horrified, absolutely horrified. He asked a medical student a question about some patient they were with, and the medical student said, "Hold on a second," whipped out their iPhone, asked the same question to Siri, looked at what Siri said, followed the link, and then read out what Wikipedia said on the topic. which is a perfectly good way to answer a question you don't know anything about. But the surgeon was horrified because the student didn't know it in their head. They could not immediately recall it. And the surgeon said, well, how come you're going to be a doctor then? Anybody could do that. Anybody could repeat the question into Siri and come back and look at the thing on the screen. Anybody can do that. Do you actually know this or not? Is it in your head or not? Which is kind of it's an interesting philosophical question, because you have to kind of wonder, if we don't know things the way we used to know them, and we use our devices to do all this, are we any good without our devices? I was actually down, as you know, in California, around about this time last year, and I met some guys who were using the prototype of Google Glass in the Glass project. And this guy, I think he's not a chemist or anything. He said, I'm going to draw the structure of the caffeine molecule without knowing anything about caffeine. And he just said, OK, glass, molecular structure of caffeine, and looked at what came up in the glasses and drew it on the board. And he apologized, actually, because he said the response time was so slow. It was 500 milliseconds or something. And he said that in the newer version, it's going to be quicker than that. And he actually said this. He said, when we get the response time down, he said, we will have the answer to your question as soon as you've finished asking it. Like, you'll say caffeine structure and it'll be there in front of you right away. And he said at that point, it'll be like knowing it. You won't have to hold it in your head because the glass will be able to show it to you right away. And I think probably the effect of Google Glass and its applications have probably been overhyped a bit. I think there was actually there's an article I was reading last night about something about Google Glass douchebaggery. They were basically saying how it's very hard to wear a piece of technology like Google Glass and not look like a nerd or a douchebag, essentially. And there's also all sorts of privacy implications, of course, because the camera in the glasses as well. So you can be wandering around taking pictures of people who don't know about it. So still, it's limited to the US. Still, you have to apply to get a pair of glasses. Still, it's $1,500. So I don't think we'll see Google Glass revolutionizing education, at least in the short term. But it's an interesting project. If you can get material as soon as you know it, and you get it by using your voice right away, that might change things in education a bit. As I said, if anyone has had this happen to them, they understand just how dependent they are on their device. I recently actually upgraded from the iPhone to an LG G2. So I now use an Android phone. And I dropped it recently, and I discovered it's much more fragile than an iPhone. I broke the screen, I had to go and get it fixed. And it's kind of a disturbing thing when this device, which is part of your life that you use for text and email and searching and everything, goes away. I was going to have my hair cut recently, and this is back when I was having the iPhone, back when I still had the iPhone. And there were two guys ahead of me, so I had to wait. The horror, I had to wait for 20 minutes to get my hair cut. And I thought, don't worry, I have my phone with me, I'll play Candy Crush Saga, or I'll look on Facebook or whatever it was. And I pulled it out of my pocket, and I discovered the battery was dead. Dead phone. I had 20 minutes to wait with no phone. The existential horror of being alone with your own thoughts for 20 minutes. And it was quite nice. After the initial panic period had worn off, I thought it was actually quite nice to sit and not think about anything, not do anything, not check on email, not be looking at anything, just be thinking about nothing. It was actually quite relaxing. So I think we have to think about what happens when our devices go down. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the assessment problem with technology. Here's this guy, and he's yes. Tomorrow's exam is open book. I don't need to study anymore. So I guess the big question with assessment is, if you can look up anything you want and get a relatively reliable answer, why are we studying it? Why do you have to learn it? It takes an enormous amount of time to go through elementary and then high school, and an enormous amount of time and money to put you through university as well. If you can get this information, if anybody can get the information as quickly as you like, what's this whole learning thing about? And it may be that there's a hidden bonus here, which is university and education in general has been focused traditionally on covering content, on chopping up the information into big blocks, which we call courses, and then putting it through the courses and having a test at the end. Maybe we should get away from our addiction with content. maybe we should teach you a bit less content and assume that you can look some of this stuff up when you need it later on down the road, and focus more on how you might apply the stuff that you actually know. And maybe we should be teaching students when they're searching to ask better questions, and to use the information they get a bit more wisely, instead of just having it in their head. I can certainly tell you the 17 most common causes of atrial fibrillation. It's kind of like a medical standard. I'm not sure that's terribly useful to anybody. I'm not sure that I could actually treat a patient who's got atrial fibrillation very well, because I haven't done that for a long time. So just having the information in your head doesn't mean much about the fact that you can practice and the fact that you can actually apply that knowledge. So those are some of the current problems that I think are happening in the field. What's happening next? And if you're interested, you should look up this RSA video by Sir Ken Robinson, who talks about how education is changing and how it's going to continue to change. In fact, I think one of the most interesting things he talks about essentially is he says that we produce graduates today the same way that Henry Ford produced motor cars. We're basically still working on the principles of mass production. We want to get as many students as possible in through the doors. We want to have giant classes. We want to pump them all out at the end of the day, and they're all pretty much the same. And he's actually saying, no, that's not going to work anymore. We need to think about some different ways of educating. We need to maybe individualize education to students a bit more and not mass produce just so much. So I'd recommend that's on YouTube. I think when I looked at it, it had been downloaded 12 million or viewed 12 million times. So Ken Robinson's a kind of a leading thinker in the field. This is something that just from the last few days, there's a new app. I think it's only on Samsung devices so far. I tried to get it on my G2 and I couldn't. And it's called Spritz. And basically, instead of having a book that you hold in your hand or having a Kindle with the words sitting on the page, there's just one little text window there. And you can set it to present text in that window at however many words you want per minute. It starts off at like 150 words a minute, and you can ramp it up until you feel comfortable. And it says that you can read like a book. You can read a 600-page novel in like 6 hours if you use this, because your eye doesn't have to waste time going to the next word and then stopping and going to the next line and going to the next chapter. It just goes straight through the whole time. So, yeah. Flits, right. I learned something today. I'm going to have to look that up. And I don't know if that's, to me it seems a little bit too efficient. Like, I think I want to take time to read a story. I want to have time for it to go into my head. I haven't really tried this. It seemed, when I kind of looked at the website, it seemed a bit tiring perhaps. Maybe you would get used to it, I don't know. Maybe that's the way to crunch through one of those giant textbooks, to kind of manage the information more efficiently and get it into your head perhaps. Maybe that's how they're going to sell it. Spritz plus textbooks. Another thing that we're doing this a little bit south of 87th Avenue. I don't know if it's been done very much north of 87th Avenue. Is the idea of the flipped classroom. Ooh, nice graphic. And the idea behind this is that let's not waste our time in class covering material or going through slides. The night before, what I do is I send an email out to students and I give them homework. I give them a case or two to work on, and I tell them, listen to this podcast or go to that website. The answers to the problem are on these resources, but you must go and figure it out before you come to class. At the start of class, we take 10 minutes to kind of review all the problems, and then the students break up into groups, maybe 2 or 3 students per group, and they get 10 minutes to work out their presentation to the rest of the group. And then we spend the rest of the time in class, each student group present their answer to the problem, and then we give them comments on how they can do things better. And then afterwards, the students check to make sure they've got what they needed to get. They ask some more questions, and they may go off and read some extra stuff. So in fact, you're not wasting time in class flipping through slides all the time. You're actually doing work in class. The downside of the flipped classroom is that you have to do a bit of homework. Like, you have to be organized the night before. It's not read this many pages and answer 20 questions in class. It's watch the video tonight and then come awake and alert and not too hungover, and I'm going to ask you some questions and get to do some work in class. So it requires a bit more effort on the part of the student, but it's probably better in terms of retention, because instead of just sitting there like an empty vessel waiting to be filled up, you're actually getting to exercise some of that knowledge and apply it to real world situations. The other thing I wanted to mention briefly is MOOCs. So a MOOC is a massive open online course. And this is where I can talk a bit about Udacity and about edX and Coursera and so forth. In fact, the University of Alberta has its own MOOC, which is Dino 101, the kind of paleontology one. So probably the first MOOC that I became aware of anyway was the AI class, which is through Sebastian Thrun at Stanford. And along with, I think, 150,000 other people, I enrolled in this free class about artificial intelligence. And it was very basic. It was Sebastian Thrun, who's this Stanford professor, with a camera in his basement. And he's just giving you the lecture that he would normally give. Except he's giving it away for free and he's putting it on the internet to anybody who wants. And it was literally, most of it was just him talking, and then occasionally you'd see him writing a formula or something about artificial intelligence. And there are now a lot more courses out there on that MOOC basis. The idea is it's massive. Anybody who wants can use it. It's open, it's free, and it's online, obviously. So this is a slide from a few months ago. There's probably over 300 courses now, 62 universities, 17 countries. And it looks like the number of users is something like 3 million across the world. Number of courses is about 300. US is big. Canada's pretty small. The UK is pretty small. And a lot of the courses are science, some information technology, but there's a growing number in business and some in arts and humanities. I was using a course in Germany recently about game design, and another one about narrative. I think was at Potsdam University, I think. And the idea is that you're able to log in for free and get the lectures that anybody else would get as if they enrolled as a student in the course. In fact, I found this little diagram about kind of where the money's going in MOOCs. So there are 4 big players at the moment: Coursera, the Khan Academy, Udacity, and then edX. And they're basically partnered with big institutions like Harvard and MIT. Udacity's actually got some relationship with Google, I think. And there's a lot of money kind of going into MOOCs. You kind of wonder, how would you make money out of a MOOC? If you're going to take material and give it away for free, how does that work? And in fact, I think the business model is centered around accreditation and assessment. So you can take the course for free, but if you want someone to believe that you've learned some of this stuff, you'll have to get assessed or pass a test, and that's where the money aspect comes in. But there is a bit of a problem with the assessment problem with MOOCs, and in fact some MOOCs have kind of had major difficulties and actually collapsed and have no longer been offered. Because of the assessment problem, it's actually hard to make sure that you've developed a good assessment tool to make sure the person has the skill that you think they have. And it's hard to interpret tests that are taken remotely. It's hard to make sure that it is that person actually taking the test. So I think that's the big problem. If there's money to be made in MOOCs, probably it's going to go to the people who can figure out how to do that online assessment. And you've got to think, well, if you're running a Physics 501 course and you've got somebody who isn't from your university but has taken a lot of MOOCs on physics, how do you know they've done the prerequisites to be successful in your course? How do you know the course that was offered in Ulaanbaatar University is any good, or that they passed the test, or that it was a good test? At least when you're actually in the room and you're doing a test with students in your institution, you've got a fair idea what the assessment is like. So it's much more difficult when you're online. The other part of the MOOC issue, which is interesting, is actually the idea, and it's kind of a larger issue we don't have time for today. It's the larger issue of being in a class of people you never meet in the real world. You know, like I was with 150,000 other people in AI class. I never sat in the same classroom as any of them. I never spoke to any of them. I might have interacted with some of them sometimes. But is there a social element, or is there a cultural element to being in a class in the same physical space as people, compared to just being in the same course online? I guess that maybe the last thing I want to talk about just very briefly is that our understanding of the brain is actually advancing quite a bit, and the kind of the neurobiology of learning. I mean, you can actually talk to people now who will tell you about effective learning strategies. which will help things be retained in your brain, like some of the speed reading stuff I showed you a minute ago. Our problem is that a lot of these strategies are not being employed right now in learning institutions like universities. So it's things like we're getting more understanding about the effects of practice. So when you learn something and you practice it, when should you practice it and what specifically should you practice? There's some data on timing and spacing of learning now. Like sitting down and crunching through a massive amount of information all at once isn't so helpful. Spacing it out is probably effective. Things like multitasking, I would actually say there's no such thing as multitasking. You cannot do two things at the one time. Your brain only has the one channel that it's operating on. There's rapid task switching from one task to another and back and forth again. I remember I used to try, I have a twin brother. I used to try and study in the same room as him, and he would always play music. And I could not deal with there being music while I was studying, because I was listening at the same time as studying. I just couldn't do it. And he found he couldn't study without music. So we ended up having to study in separate rooms, because he just couldn't cope with the fact that I wanted his music turned off all the time, because I think I've got a single channel brain. Rereading is probably not very useful. It's that terrible time when you're getting ready for the exam and it's the night before and it's midnight and you haven't covered the material, you don't know it, and you're trying to get it into your short-term memory, and you're rereading and going over the same section again and again, and it just won't go in. Rereading doesn't really work very well. But active retrieval and testing does. So things like flashcards work better. Things like working with a classmate to ask each other questions, that works better than just going back over the material again and again. There's quite a bit of evidence now from the neurobiological side that elaborating and connecting things are useful as well. So actually making connections with different things you've learned in different courses, and elaborating and explaining to people how things work is a good way to get things stuck in your brain. Context is very important as well. I must admit, I found it very hard to learn about medical conditions if I haven't seen a patient with that very thing. There's a condition called multiple endocrine neoplasia type 2, and there's a list of tumours associated with that, and I just cannot remember them. I've never seen a patient with that, because I don't have it in my head. I don't have a context. I don't have a person in my head that's had that condition. I find it very hard to learn kind of outside context. It's the other thing that's useful is trying to develop general rules, trying to step back from the immediate material that you're covering and trying to look at general rules that cross barriers between one course and another. And then the last piece is basically, say, talking about patients again, linking it to concrete experiences. Knowledge in the abstract is hard to remember, but knowledge in the concrete linked to real events is actually a bit easier. I can talk very briefly about some work that I've done in technology and education with a thing called Surgery 101, which is a podcast and an app and a website as well. The idea being that we would combine surgery with technology, namely the iPod, and make a simple weekly podcast to cover surgery. And we've been fairly successful. We've now got just over 1.25 million downloads in 175 countries. So lots of people are listening to Surgery 101, to me talking about surgery and different things. We don't have anybody in North Korea or Greenland. I think we're missing Cuba and then one country. I'm not sure if that's French Guiana or Suriname or somewhere. One of those little countries at the top of South America. We don't have much in Central Africa. We have lots of people listening in Canada and the States, in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand as well. So we've done quite a bit on that side. I could leave you with another book, actually. This is another guy called Daniel Pink, A Whole New Mind. He talks about why right-brainers will rule the future. And in fact, I think you could apply a lot of what he says to education. That if you want to make an impact in the 21st century, you've got to stick to some of these principles, which is basically designing education to engage more than one sense, to use narrative and story instead of just argument, to step away from details and be more inventive and think about big pictures, what he calls sympathy, to engage emotion and intuition, which he calls empathy, and to kind of be a little bit lighthearted if you're teaching, and bring in humor. And then the big one is actually meaning at the end. What's the point of this? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? The whole education thing. We've actually got a little bit of media attention recently for what's called Muppet Surgery, which is a project we've done with Alberta Health Services and NAIT and Grant McEwen and our industry sponsor Covidian, where we've brought Muppets into the operating room and are teaching about surgery through that, which is a kind of a weird thing, right? Got puppets in the operating room, and we did a script and we had a little story and stuff. So, I mean, that's how I've applied technology in my career in education, and we've got lots of other ideas we're working on as well. So that's all I've got to say. It's 3 o'clock, so I'm happy to take any questions you've got.
So, following up on Daniel Pink's ideas, you know, this course has no required content. There's no specific facts that the students need to learn. It's a lot of educational theory, like the hole-in-the-wall computer and these little kids who learn how to do, you know, amazing things without any teaching other than just the keyboard. Theories that the open-ended question is a lot better than the question with a specific answer. So although almost every course has required content, do you think life has required content? Or is, you know, Daniel Pink right that it's really the big picture and the feelings and the overarching principles and maybe skills and, you know, tacit knowledge, that's what's really important, and that we're too focused on facts?
Yeah, I think actually I've increasingly come to realize how important stories are in teaching.
Yeah.
It's all very well to say this is the material and here's how you have to learn it and that's it, but you don't really understand why until you link it to a story, to something that happened to a real person that makes the point of why you need to know this stuff. There was a nice study called Significant Objects they did on eBay a while ago. They went to a charity store and they bought a whole lot of junk and they put it on eBay and they got almost no money for it. And then they got a writer to take each piece of junk and write a story associated with it, to say this piece is important to me for some reason. It's quite a short thing, just a few paragraphs, and stuck those items back on eBay again. And they got much more money for them when there was a story associated. So I think this is the story piece is important and the meaning piece is important. I mean, I kind of want to know, yes, there are no prerequisites for this course, that's great. And there isn't a big test at the end, right? This material will not be on the test. There's no multiple choice at the end of all of this. But I kind of want to know why students come to this course, what they get out of it, and what it means to them and what part of their story this is. Because at some point, they're going to hear a weird person like me say some idea in front of them that sparks something in their head too, right, that's going to change something they do in the future. So
there's a guy in the UK with a background in smartphone development who intends to put together a course on the future and transhumanism, and he's trying to come up with the multiple choice questions that there should be. And the first one that he's working on is, what's the origin of the word transhumanism? Who first used it? And actually, it's impossible to answer that, and it's not a very important. I don't think any of you know the answer, and I didn't really know it either.
Who cares?
I mean, who cares, you know?
I don't care.
And it shows you, we could take the same subjects and require you to memorize stupid things like who first used the word, and completely wreck, you know, the educational experience. So why don't I pass this on to these guys?
I actually want some questions on it. I want to hear about what the experience is of being a student in 2014 and having to manage with some of the things that I think you're managing with.
So you want to hear about my personal experiences?
Or a question.
If I could, I'd like to start with a question. So when you were discussing today about all the students having the recorded lectures and those things like that, it seemed like that was the way to go. And you said so many people were enjoying the recorded lectures, they found it a lot more capable to like handle it. I was wondering, did you guys find any evidence that would point to why students should be in the classroom then with the teacher?
I think, let me see, evidence. I don't think you're going to get much evidence to say one way or the other. I think it's probably learner preference. I mean, the students are paying tuition and they want to kind of see their lecturer, they want to be in the physical space and have a chance to ask questions. I think that's one good reason to show up. There is a certain, feeling like you have to be present. The other side of the coin, actually, we've had some lecturers who get quite upset when not a lot of students turn up for their lecture, because they feel good when they get 240 students show up for them. It makes them feel like a fantastic teacher. And when only 60 turn up, they don't feel so popular. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's kind of the ego of teaching, whereas I actually enjoy when fewer students turn up because it makes it a bit easier. So there's only one study I'm aware of that actually looked at that and compared students who show and students who don't show. And the students who don't show lag behind in performance for the first 3 or 4 months, and then they catch up. I suspect that's it. And there is, it's not purely about, university is not purely about knowledge. It's about kind of becoming a scholar, becoming a student, engaging in the society of the university, engaging in the culture of the university. So I think it'd be weird if you never showed up to anything. But I don't think you have to show up to everything by any means.
I just have a question regarding like the story aspect of how to learn, because I've had one textbook in which I would read over and just highlight the important facts, and eventually it came down to any information whatsoever, and there'd be times where there's maybe one thing highlighted over 2 pages because of stories. So is it necessarily the actual best way to learn if it's all story-based or narrative-based?
Well, I don't know if I would say you can only learn through story. I think there's certain facts you've got to kind of figure out for yourself, but it's the application of those facts, I think, that are worthwhile with the story piece, because you actually say, well, okay, this is why I need to know this, So that's how I would come with that. And I think there's no best way to learn. Really, it's very individual. I almost think our university should kind of take you aside at the start when you come for the first time and have a discussion about what some of the strategies for learning might be, and what things you've found successful in the past and what things you struggle with in the past. Because I'm sure there's lots of people out there who are struggling with stuff that could actually be fixed if they had a consultation with somebody who knows about the different ways to learn. What about your experience? How would you compare your experience as learners today with me in 1987?
Well, I think I'll go first on this, because as a child, our family was too poor to invest in a computer, so much of my early learning was very much on paper, the old school style. So in those days, I went to an academic school where they forced you to do homework. You had to get your homework done to sort of get the grades. And I think in that environment, I learned more to apply than to memorize a lot of facts. We weren't given a lot of facts in class. It's much more just do the homework, apply. And taking this to high school, where we actually get the technology finally, and just sort of discover a new learning style, I felt it was quite easy integrating into that system, because already I was trained to apply. And moving on towards university, where there's much more content, it might be overwhelming for some courses. You have to memorize, and I found I struggled a bit at first at memorizing all this stuff. But I figured out that maybe a combined approach of applications and integrating, memorizing information and actually integrating it into your applications was really helpful.
Yeah, I should point out actually our friends we were staying with in New Zealand, their kids were going back to school. Actually, it's just the start of the school year, because the summer's over in the southern hemisphere, and the parents were having to decide, and they had to kind of fill in a form to say, were they going to send their kids to school with an iPad or not? Because I think they could afford an iPad and they were going to get an iPad and stuff. And clearly some children in the class had iPads and phones and some didn't. So it's not like education is a level playing field anymore. Some people are going to have the devices and have access to a wireless network, and some aren't. And that's a complicated thing as well. I was going to ask, has anybody in the room used Evernote? Okay. And has anybody in the room bought an electronic textbook, like bought a PDF of a textbook or bought it on Kindle or something? Yeah. So, 'cause I've kind of tried Evernote. I didn't really click with it, and I haven't actually done the textbook thing. So how do you study from an electronic textbook?
I think that the best thing about electronic textbooks for me is just being able to Control F and find the word that you're looking for on any
Yeah.
page that it's on.
You can
Whereas
search it.
otherwise you have to like go through an index and maybe you're looking for the wrong word and you can't figure it out that way. That's why I prefer electronic textbooks, and also they're a lot less expensive. You only use them for a semester anyway, so you just kind of rent them and then you're done with them.
And how do you make notes, or do you annotate, or what do you do?
The ones that I buy, you can highlight them, and then your highlights get saved, and you can make little notes. And then it's also really helpful that way that you can pull up a page of all of the notes that you've made throughout the textbook, so you don't have to constantly be flipping through the page. It's very summarized and very...
And do you ever find yourself printing like a printed version?
It depends on the class. But yeah, and I also like the online textbooks because there's a lot of interactive features. Like a lot of them have end of chapter tests or flashcards associated with them, which you just don't get in a physical textbook.
Yeah, okay. Okay, another question. A little bit Evernote.
I think the online textbooks are just more convenient because you don't have to carry like 5 pounds worth of textbook everywhere you go. So it's more easily accessible. But I think for myself, I don't really like reading off a screen. I like reading off paper. So even novels and stuff, I still buy my novels. I don't like Kindle, and I don't like reading off screens. I have electronic textbooks for the courses where I don't have to read the entire textbook for the course. So I can use it as reference quickly on my computer, but I'm not necessarily reading lots from the textbook.
I just have a question. Since you've been an experienced teacher, educator for a while, have you seen classes once they introduce the technology of PowerPoint and like sending out the slides to everyone? Has there been a change in the overall class performances through years? I think no.
Don't think so. I think the students are the same, the materials largely the same, so I don't think there's much difference. I think you see for me, using PowerPoint actually, I don't know if you've ever looked up you can find Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in PowerPoint, which is like the most dispiriting, awful PowerPoint ever with bullet lists and stuff. It's just terrible. And you see people who are using PowerPoint who are using it in the same way that Lincoln never used it, of course. And who actually read their slides, like they have text and they read their slides. It's just awful. I find myself, as I go further, I'm using less and less text on slides and more pictures. And the picture stimulates me to think of something, and then I tell a little story based on the picture, and then it's kind of just a series of pictures now. It's very hard to take notes on that, obviously. I feel sorry for students who try to be taking notes on this lecture because there's so many pictures all over the place, right? But maybe working with some of the guys that I work with at NAIT in digital media, I think in general, as a society, we're becoming more visual and we're becoming more CE and less ready, if you know what I mean. Look at the success of YouTube and Netflix and everything. So I think PowerPoint's kind of good and bad, but it can be used for very good stuff.
I thought I would just ask you, you'd mentioned briefly the disparity that's kind of emerging at younger and younger ages for those that can and cannot afford maybe an iPad in elementary school. Like, I'm just thinking now a laptop or some access to a computer is pretty much necessary at university. I know I had my laptop stolen in first year, and I was essentially couldn't do much homework at all for a couple of weeks while I figured it out. So I wonder if you could just maybe touch on how you see this being remedied. Like if we are requiring certain devices at elementary school, is it something that's worth putting funding towards, or trying to remedy in any way?
I don't know if it needs to be remedied. I suppose there's a market for this, and the devices are getting cheaper anyway, so Maybe eventually everybody will have an iPad and a laptop. I mean, I suppose the question is, I mean, I suppose if you look at the number of devices, like the sheer number of devices that people have. So you got a phone, you maybe got an iPad or some kind of tablet as well as a laptop. I know my father was having a conversation recently where he was trying to figure out whether he should buy an iPad or a laptop. We were having the question about, do you need a separate keyboard or not? So lots of people will choose lots of different things, I suppose. I think the question is what do you need to be capable of without your device? Will you be ever in a situation where you don't have your device with you? And I'm not suggesting we've got a generation of people coming who won't know anything separately from their devices. Clearly you will know something, but how much of that is necessary? How much do you need to have in your head, and how much can you outsource to your device? I'm trying to think how much of the work that I do, like in the hospital, requires me to look things up, and the answer is almost none, because of the knowledge that I have and because of the experience that I've developed. Occasionally I'll come across something I've never heard of, or occasionally I'll come across a drug or something and I can't remember the dose, and I might look that up sometimes, but that's about it. And I think probably you want to get to that point in your career as well, later on when you're finally finished training, where you've got most of the information you need within your head, but you can use your device to do extra stuff as well. I mean, the thing you want to avoid is that you're in practice, you're doing whatever you end up finally doing, and you don't know some of the basics. You've relied upon your devices for that. I mean, maybe I could ask you a question back. How much of the material that you're learning do you think comes from a textbook compared to random searching on the internet or Wikipedia? Or do you just focus on what's in the textbook, what's on the set course, and you don't look outside that?
Well, for me, usually, when I study, if I don't understand anything or have a question, instead of asking the prof first, I look it up on the internet, and if it's not there, that's when I ask the prof. Because for me, I feel like independently study is better, because I actually apply my knowledge on how to search stuff and on what kind of question should I ask.
And how do you know the answer you find is good?
There's just a bunch of answers on Google. Sometimes I ask, let's say for genetics, on how does this method arise, and then there's a bunch of people like geneticists or on forums or even on the internet that says this is the proper way. Some people say this is the other way, and then I have my slides in front of me or like my notes, and then which one like corresponds with that is the one I will like try to see, and then to see it's right, I just ask the prof anyways, and then they just kind of say that, yeah, that's the way it should go. And if there's any more other questions, like I just search the internet basically. If it's not on the internet, you just ask the prof.
Okay.
Also, I have a question. So you say that since technologies and knowledge is being ubiquitous, right? Do you think people in the future, for like let's say doctors, do you think they'll rely on their technology more, or do you think still that they'll have the internal knowledge for to be a proper profession?
I'm hoping it'll probably stay much as it is, that you'll have most of the knowledge internalized, and you only go outside for stuff that's unfamiliar to you, I suppose. But who knows, I suppose.
We've got a really quick question. So you're talking about kids not knowing, I kind of made the assumption that you were talking about this, but in your answer earlier, you were asking how a student's supposed to know what the right answer is. And I'm going to throw that back at you and ask, well, how do students get taught what the answer is? And I mean, how are we supposed to be educated about knowing in the hill of knowledge that's out there what is right? I mean, I remember taking a computing science class or like information technology in junior high, and we just got to learn how to make a web page. That's it.
Yeah, I think you need to be able to ask efficient questions, you know. And it's maybe not about learning exactly the facts that are set out in front of you, but having a kind of a fairly critical approach to learning itself and to the information in general. Like actually saying, well, okay, it's my job to get this material and pass the test at the end of the course. I mean, everybody wants to pass the test, they can move on to the next thing, right? But also you've got to keep it in the back of your mind, I'm going to need this material down the road to do something with it. Like, this is important to learn, not just to pass the test, but to be useful and be productive in some way later on down the road. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as well. I mean, I kind of think if I was 20 again and I was doing this all over again, it'd be a great time to be a student, because there's so much information, there's so many different sources you could get, and you could really make your professor's life a misery by asking complicated questions, or by asking controversial questions, actually, like questions to which there are no right answers. You could say, well, but Professor so-and-so, you said X, but this other expert from Harvard says Y. Can you explain the differences? And when you get, it's almost one of the best ways to learn is to get two experts to argue in front of you, where the first expert says, no, you're completely wrong because, and they explain their reasoning, and the second expert says, no, you're completely wrong because whatever. And that's actually, when you see two people who really know their field arguing over stuff, that's, I think, where you finally get the point of what's important. So I quite like the fact that you guys have now got the keys to the universe, the keys to the information universe. You can ask a question that I don't know the answer to, which is fantastic.
So we're out of time. That only means that the videography ends now. There isn't anybody else in this room, so obviously the students can keep on chatting with you a bit. Thanks for an absolutely outstanding session. I think we all wished it could go on forever. So.
Thank you very much.